wherever you are, just feel into your seat a bit. It's really nice to get out of our minds and into our bodies. Try to sit with a straight back, or as straight as can be, while still being relaxed. And think about the top of your head is facing up to the ceiling. So you don't want to have your chin up too much or down too much. I always like to begin these meditations by quoting Jon Kabat-Zinn, a very famous teacher of mindfulness. And he says, if we can sit with our bodies in balance, it helps our minds to feel more balanced as well. So with that bit of inspiration from a wonderful teacher, you can either have your eyes open with a bit of a soft gaze. You can think about your eyes maybe being a third to a half shut, looking out with a soft gaze, a foot or two or three ahead of you. Or if you'd like, you can close your eyes. I usually meditate with my eyes closed, and that's fine too. And let's begin. So I like to begin these meditations by really placing each of us in our environment. It might be the first time you're not having your mind racing. You can just relax into the feeling of your body and just how it feels to be seated in whatever chair or couch or on the edge of your bed, whatever you're seated on. Just notice what that feels like. I begin each day with gratitude exercises, and today I was grateful for my body being able to function because I was doing it while I was jogging. And I was grateful for my environment. There were some people with kids walking around, so I was grateful for kids. And then I couldn't think of a third one, so I just said, I'm grateful for gravity. I'm grateful that I'm not floating up. And that made me smile a bit. So perhaps we can all take a moment and smile and be grateful for the gravity that keeps us in our seats. And I thought that today I would bring us into a noting practice. This can be a wonderful way to actually, believe it or not, stop the whirling of our minds for a moment amidst these times. And so just notice to yourself, what's most present for you? If your eyes are open, are you seeing? If they're closed, perhaps it's hearing, whether it's the sound of my voice or anything in your environment. If you notice your mind really thinking a lot, don't worry, that's how our brains are wired, so there's no judgment on that. Just note to yourself the very simple word, thinking. And then if you notice yourself planning something, perhaps dinner later, something tomorrow or later in the week, you can just label that planning. And if you're starting to feel some sensations in your body, whether it's pleasant sensations or unpleasant ones, you can just label that sensations. Or even feeling. And perhaps you might notice yourself beginning to settle a bit. And if that's the case, you can just label that settling or calming. If you're noticing your breath, that's wonderful. You can just label that breathing. And so this is called a noting practice. It is a type of mindfulness. You don't need to note every second, but every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 seconds, just notice what is most present for you. And there's no judgment on this. And then let that slip away, and a few moments or seconds later, you can note the next thing that's most present for you. You might feel tightness. You might feel relaxation. You might feel your mind expanding. You might have a feeling of connection because we're all connected on this beautiful call together. Or perhaps you might feel isolated or lonely if you're on your own. Just note that. And sometimes in noting it, that makes it slip away and something else comes in that's more present. So you might notice breathing, and then again breathing. And then a few moments later, you might notice tightness, perhaps in your stomach or your jaw. And then a few moments later, you might notice expansion, your mind just settling and expanding. Whatever you notice, just label it, note it, and then see what comes up next. In this way, we become really in touch with this Buddhist concept of impermanence, and we see how impermanent everything is, even our feelings and our sensations. And sometimes, even just by noting it, like thinking, we can let a whole string of thought just go away. But just see what happens as you very gently note your most present experience every few seconds. Any sensation, pleasant or unpleasant, can simply be sensation. Any notice of sound is simply hearing. So just to close this mindfulness meditation, I invite you to now place your attention mindfully on your feet. And just notice how they feel in this moment. Perhaps you're wearing socks or shoes. Just notice what that feels like. Can you feel the ground underneath you, or if you're sitting cross-legged, a chair or a couch? Does whatever is beneath you feel soft or coarse? How relaxing is it to just simply notice that and then not to judge it? Just a very gentle awareness. And then notice how your hands feel, whether they're placed on your knee or in your lap. And then find your breath. And just notice whether the breath feels relaxed or stilted in any way? Does it feel rushed or smooth? Just see if you can feel a deep appreciation at the beginning of the inhale for this new breath that's joining you. And then feel the relaxation of the gentle flow of the exhale. And when you're ready, you can stretch your arms up. So good. You can stretch your legs out. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. Ah, so beautiful to meditate together. Thank you. Hi to Amy in South Carolina. You guys have had some intense days there. Wonderful to see you. Hi to Matt Weeks. Thank you to everyone who's just joined us. Look forward to chatting with you when we get to the chat. So now I am really excited and honored to introduce Catherine Sanderson. She is the Polar Family Professor and actually chair of the psychology department at Amherst College. I will not hold that against her because I went to Wesleyan and people think that Wesleyan and Amherst and Williams are rivals, but deep respect for Amherst and all of the tennis courts that are there. I did go on a tour of Amherst and they said that there were more tennis courts there than in anywhere in the country, I think, per square capita, something like that. Catherine has published over 25 journal articles and book chapters, in addition to 4 college textbooks, middle school and high school health textbooks and trade books on parenting, as well as how mindset influences happiness, health, and even how long we live. That was from The Positive Shift. In 2012, she was named one of the country's top 300 professors by the Princeton Review. I think I owe the Princeton Review for getting me into college, so thank you. Catherine speaks regularly for public and corporate audiences on topics such as the science of happiness. We love that. The power of emotional intelligence. We love that too. The art of aging well. We're doing well on that with meditation, which helps reduce the signs of aging. Thanks to the effect on the telomeres. So we're pretty good on that, Catherine, I hope. And the psychology of courage and inaction. These talks have been featured in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, USA Today, The Atlantic, CNN, and CBS Sunday Morning, and more. She also writes a weekly blog for Psychology Today, Norms Matter, that examines the power of social influence on virtually all aspects of our lives. Her latest trade book is Why We Act, Turning Bystanders into Moral Rebels, published by Harvard University Press. And it examines a topic that has really been obviously prominent in the press, which is why good people so often stay silent or do nothing in the face of wrongdoing. So she has talked about this in a TEDx talk on the psychology of inaction, which talks about the factors that contribute to inaction and provide strategies that each of us can use to help people act, even when people around them are not. So with all that, Catherine, obviously this is perhaps the most pressing conversation, or one of the most pressing conversations of our day because of everything we've seen in the news. So over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you for that lovely introduction. I care deeply about this topic and really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. And I want to start with a story. So as my lovely introduction described, I had published a book in January of 2019 called The Positive Shift, which was very much on positivity and mindfulness and so on. And shortly after that book came out, my oldest son started college, and he's very independent. He's very much an extrovert. You know, I didn't worry about him at all. Dropped him off in his dorm, set him up with, you know, a mini fridge and rug from Walmart, drove home. And 2 weeks later, he called for the first time, and his voice was breaking. And he said, "Mom, a student in my dorm died last night." And it's a story that's all too familiar for all of us, even if you don't know the school or the person. A student had been drinking late at night. he fell and hit his head, and his roommate and friends watched over him for hours. They wanted him to be okay. So they strapped a backpack to his shoulders so he wouldn't roll onto his back and vomit and choke to death. They kept to make sure he was still breathing. They put him in bed and watched over him. But what they didn't do for 19 hours was call 911. And by the time they did call, it was too late. His family flew in from out of town. They were with him when the hospital disconnected him from life support, but he died, 19 years old, 2 weeks into college. So as a mom, as a professor of many students, I was just obsessed with that story and how it could have gone differently. So in theory, I was doing heavy book promotion on a topic of happiness and health. And I was doing, interviews and podcast things and, talking to the media. And then I would go and I would research. And I literally started writing about the Holocaust and fraternity hazing and the civil rights movement and so on. And that became my latest book, which is called Why We Act, the title of this webinar. And I want to just briefly talk about this. But before I do, I want to ask you a question, you all a question. And you can, I think I can see everybody, but maybe not. Maybe some people are not on video. So maybe we'll use the chat room. Here's my question. Who here has ever been in a situation where you've seen something, heard something, witnessed something, thought it was a problem, and failed to speak up and say something, do something? If that's ever happened to you, just write yes. And if it's never happened to you, write no. But just, we'll take 10 seconds or so and write yes or no in the chat room. And so I'm seeing a slew of yeses. Then Matt is noting that he's the person who, and there are some people, and I actually talk about those people in chapter 9 of the book, Moral Rebels. But so, and Dina, that's not surprising to me, nothing personal. Anyway, so here's the thing. I've been talking about this book in the process of writing, in the process of book promotion. I ask this question all the time. And virtually everybody has a story. They have a story about a time in which they were at a restaurant, in a grocery store, on an airplane, at a hotel, and they remember it. And sometimes they remember it from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So that's what my book examines. My book examines this totally universal phenomenon that we've all experienced of being somewhere, seeing something, and just failing to speak up. And although this book came out in April, so it came out recently, it's a story that has actually changed and shaped how I think about it over the last few months. So the book came out April 7th, and there was a lot of, sort of promotion around it. And one of my friends called, who lives in Boston. She has a daughter who she adopted from China when the daughter was a baby, 2. And the friend called and said, I want to tell you a story that happened to Claire on the bus. So Claire had been on the bus heading to work in Boston. She's like 21 or 22. And a man who was clearly, kind of disturbed, stood up and said, you should go back to China. You and your people brought us the coronavirus. This was in March of this year. And so Claire was, of course, totally upset. But what her mom said to me was, no one on the bus stood up and told that man to shut up. No one told him to be quiet. No one told her, that she was okay. No one went over and, sat with her or anything. And that to me, of course, illustrates that this happens all the time in all sorts of circumstances. When I first saw the pictures of George Floyd's death, what struck me was frankly not the cop. It was the other cops, the other 3 officers who didn't pull him off of him and say, what are you doing? And that actually bothered me enough that I wrote an op-ed that was in USA Today. If you Google me, it'll come up. But that I co-wrote it with the former president of the NAACP because we were just struck by, if police training had gone properly, the other officers would have stepped up and George Floyd would be alive today. So what leads people to not speak up in an emergency? And basically the totality of the research in psychology points to 3 things. 1, we don't totally know what's going on. And the reality is that sometimes emergencies are ambiguous. We don't really recognize what's happening. There's a story that I describe, and it starts chapter 2 of my book, that some of you may be familiar with. It's a story of little Jamie Bolger, who was 2 years old. He was in a shopping mall in England. He became separated from his mom, and they looked everywhere for him. They couldn't find him. And 2 days later, they found his body beside some railroad tracks. He'd been beaten to death. So they went back through the videotaped surveillance, and what they saw was him being led away by 2 older boys. And very clearly, those older boys were dragging him. Jamie was like, "Leave me alone, let me go." He didn't want to go. But here's the reality. A lot of people saw it, but we've all seen a 2-year-old having a fit in the mall. No one assumed, oh, he must be getting kidnapped. They saw something, but they didn't know what it was. And the reality is that in many cases, we see or hear something and we're confused. Is that person just drunk, or are they unconscious and in need of help? Is that a potential sexual assault, or is that a consensual romantic encounter? Is that joke racist or homophobic or sexist, or is it just funny? Am I overreacting? So in lots of cases, we recognize something, but we fail to label it as a problem. So one issue, ambiguity. Second issue, even when we recognize this is a problem, we don't feel responsible. Many of you have probably heard about the effect that's called in psychology the bystander effect, in which there are lots of people, and so each one of them is like, nah, I don't really have to help because somebody else can do it. It's not my responsibility. Many of us remember seeing a few years ago footage of a man being dragged off an airplane, a United plane in Chicago that was overbooked. And you remember the footage. I imagine none of you were on the plane, but you remember the footage because the people on the plane thought it was a problem. They didn't think it was no big deal. They thought it was a problem. And therefore, they took out their phones and they started recording it. And as soon as they got off the plane, they posted it all over social media, which is why we've seen it. But here's what struck me. No one on the plane stood up and said, "Stop dragging this guy off the plane. Like, this is horrific. Stop doing it. There's another way." And again, none of these people were the pilot or the flight attendants or police officers. They were just people sitting on a plane. So in lots of situations, even when we recognize this is a problem, it's not our responsibility. I believe most of the people on the bus in Boston with my friend's daughter, Claire, were like, that's a problem. That's an absolute problem. But they were like, well, I'm just on a bus. It's not my responsibility to call out this crazy guy. So 1, there's ambiguity. 2, there's a feeling of it's not my responsibility, even when we recognize it is a problem. 3, even if we recognize it's a problem and we recognize we kind of should do something, we should step up, we worry about the consequences. We worry about the professional consequences. After the Harvey Weinstein thing came out, they asked people all around Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino, did you know what was happening? And lots of people were like, yeah, I did know what was happening. But Harvey Weinstein was making or breaking careers. Actresses worried about reporting him. People worried that he would have a major impact on their ability to get work in their chosen profession. They didn't call it out. But we also worry about social consequences. We don't want to be rejected by our friends, our family members, our colleagues, people in our social group, our fraternity brothers, our teammates. And so in other cases, we stay silent because we worry about the consequences. And so the challenge is, if everybody is worried about the consequences, even if everyone thinks it's a big problem, no one actually steps up and does anything because they think they're the only one. When I was describing writing this book to one of my students, really smart kid, he's on the basketball team at Amherst College, smart student, thesis student of mine, I was describing this and he said, it's interesting. Every single day in the locker room, someone says something offensive. And sometimes I speak up, but sometimes I don't. And that to me, of course, is the perfect example, because what's occurring to me is that probably a lot of the other people in that locker room are also going, that's offensive, that's a problem. But each one of them is saying, let's not speak up. And so basically, inaction is breeding inaction. And we know from research in psychology and neuroscience that one of the reasons we don't speak up is that the fear of being rejected and ostracized by our social group is actually processed in the same part of the brain that processes physical pain. So being rejected, ostracized by people in our group feels just the same as physical pain. The physical pain of spilling hot coffee on your arm or getting a paper cut or spraining your ankle. So we're highly motivated to avoid speaking up in all kinds of situations. So those are the three factors. We don't know what's going on. We know what's going on, but we don't feel responsible. We know what's going on, we feel responsible, but we worry about the consequences, professionally, safety, personal, and so on, so we don't speak up. But in my final couple moments, because I know it's been a little depressing now, I want to talk about what we can do. And the reason why I wrote the book is that I'm hoping that educating people about the psychological factors that will lead us not to speak up can actually give people the tools they need to speak up. And the good news is there are some people, I think a few of you self-identified, I'm thinking maybe Dina and Matt, self-identified as what psychologists call moral rebels, people who are sort of willing to speak up. And so that's great. If you have those traits, it's wonderful. But if you don't have those traits, there are actually things that we can all do that scientific research tells us make a difference. And here's what we know. Number one, practice and train. So we've all heard about microaggressions. People say things that are, sort of problematic, but they're not sort of overtly problematic. And the question is, when somebody does something, you need to be able to speak up. Many of us have had a situation in which somebody has said something problematic, and 24 hours later in the shower, we're like, oh, that's the response I should have given. But that's too late because they're not in the shower with you. And so the key is that practicing how you can respond before you're in that situation, have some lines. What do you mean by that? Or, I know that you're just joking, but that really isn't something to joke about. Or, what do you mean women are too emotional to be president, et cetera. Having some responses that you can use and call up and practicing them will let you be able to call them up at the time. So one, develop some strategies, practice them. Two, foster empathy. It's much easier to speak up when you can connect with the other person who's in a situation. If it was my daughter on a bus in Boston being attacked by a crazy guy, I would really want somebody else to sit with her and to speak up and call him out. So trying to develop empathy for the person who's being the victim of something physically violent or offensive or racially insensitive and so on is really helpful. So feel empathy, develop empathy, foster empathy. There's the wonderful poem we all can probably remember about the Holocaust of first they came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Catholics and then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak up for me. So foster empathy. 3, look for ethical leaders. Ethical leaders set the tone. They do this in fraternities, they do it in teams, they do it in offices, they do it in religious organizations, they do it in politics. Find ethical leaders and try to work for them, try to get to know them because they're really setting the tone for everybody else. 4, find a friend. It's much easier to speak up when we have someone else doing it with us. And we can think of examples both present day and historical in which finding a friend has been the secret. 2 whistleblowers called out the blood doping scandal at Theranos and brought down that fraudulent practice by Elizabeth Holmes and her colleagues. 2 Swedish graduate students pulled Brock Turner off of an unconscious woman he was sexually assaulting at Stanford University. 4 students integrated the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Finding a friend helps many of us be brave, even if we don't have the ability to do so on our own. And finally, most importantly, and the reason I love talking about this topic, social norms can change once there's a tipping point of enough people doing something different. And what's amazing is that in all sorts of circumstances, people actually can be convinced by believing what other people are doing. A fascinating study by researchers at Yale found that the best way to increase voting isn't to tell people voting is American. Here's your polling place. It's a democratic responsibility. None of that's the best. The best, tell people all of your neighbors are voting. Your neighbors vote. That increases peer pressure. Another fascinating study designed to increase water conservation in hotels, they put little placards out. Some people got a little placard that said, please reuse your towels. It really helps save Mother Earth. Other people got a little placard that said, most of your fellow hotel guests reuse their towels because they care about Mother Earth. And what they found? People don't really care about Mother Earth. What they care about is knowing that other people care about Mother Earth. And if other people care about Mother Earth, they should also care about Mother Earth. Again, all of these are examples of ways in which social norms can change. And I want to share with you now, I'm actually going to read this. This is the final paragraph of my book. And it's from a passage by John Steinbeck from East of Eden. And here's the passage. Humans are caught in their lives, in their thoughts, in their hungers and ambitions, in their avarice and cruelty, and in their kindness and generosity too, in a net of good and evil. A man, after he has brushed off the dust and chips of his life, will have left only the hard, clean questions. Was it good or was it evil? Have I done well or ill? And what I'm hoping is that giving people insight into the factors that sometimes lead us not to speak up can give us all the ability to speak up and call out bad behavior of all kinds in all different situations. So I'm done. Thank you so much for listening, and stay safe, everyone. And I know we're going to do a little bit of Q&A now.
Yeah.
I also just want to say, I assume you all have my contact information. Is that true, Gina? Is that not true?
We're going to send it to everyone. We're going to send your contact info and a link to the book and a few other things to everybody.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that if there's a question that I know we have a little bit of time, but if there's a question, totally fine to email me, afterwards if we don't have time to get to it today. Obviously, I really care about the topic. So thank you so much.
Oh, okay. That was extraordinary. It was super inspiring. Oh, and I see in terms of contact info stuff, let's make sure we send it to the people on this call also, in addition to the book. And I can attest to the fact that I met Catherine on a call similar to this, actually, and asked her a question, and she responded very personally and very thoughtfully. So, but let's try to get to some of the questions here. Matt, you brought up a number of wonderful points, one of which saying that you disagree on the locker room as a blanket statement, but I didn't know if you had a set question that you wanted to ask. I wanted to give you a chance to ask that. Oh, Matt, I think you're on mute.
There I go. Hi, Catherine, class of 1980, the great class of 1980. I don't know if any of my old professors are still even there anymore.
Now we have like 2 minutes for all the questions.
Upstanders, bystanders. I think one of the biggest challenges we have, for me as a cisgendered, white, privileged, straight guy, I can take care of myself. I can pretty much step in with privilege anywhere, anytime. And because I'm one of those weirdos who steps in, I do. It's hard to lead. All I can do is lead, but I see people still scared. What should we do to get those people involved, and what's a safe way to get people to be that gang of upstanders?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's wonderful if anyone is actually willing to be an upstander. That's actually modeling really important behavior. And people who are in a position of privilege, that's actually something they can do. So saying this is problematic when it comes from somebody who's in a position of privilege, that actually carries particular weight. So modeling that behavior, reinforcing that behavior is extraordinarily important. And thanks for doing that. We need more people to do that all the time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Matt. Okay, 2 quick questions. One from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. How do you know when to pick your battles and what battles to pick?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot because people now say, now I feel responsible for being like the police, and like at every moment I've got to step up. So here's the thing. I think we need to have a repertoire of skills, and I think we need to evaluate in a given situation. In some settings, it may not be safe. Maybe you're a low person in terms of priority in the office, and you really can't afford to lose this job. I describe a story in the book about having an internship in college and driving with my boss. My boss was driving. We were running late. He was totally able-bodied. He pulled into a handicap spot. And he then looked at me and kind of limped as we walked to the building. And I knew it was wrong. I was like 19, 20, and I was like, that's super wrong. But I didn't say anything. I needed a letter of recommendation. I didn't say anything. So this isn't saying you got to speak out all the time, but it's saying if afterwards you're going to kick yourself because you didn't speak up, that's a time to do so.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. Thank you. And especially now, if people, I mean, it's such an a time of economic uncertainty. If you need that job, then, you want to be smart and take care of yourself also. That's wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. Hershey has asked a wonderful question. How does this vary by culture?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot also. And to be honest, there's not a lot of good cross-cultural data on it. But what research has shown is that there are some cultures, in particular Asian cultures, in which there's much more of a sense of needing to fit in with the group, and that being different is especially problematic. There's an expression that I give to my students. So here's the sort of American expression. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And of course, that's basically be a pain in the ass, right? Here's the parallel expression in Japan. The peg that stands out gets pounded down. So that's kind of the difference by culture. But there's not good data on all the stuff I've talked about, so I don't want to generalize.
Yeah, in Australia and New Zealand, they talk a lot about the tall weed theory, that you don't want to be the tall weed, and it's a big problem in terms of trying to spawn entrepreneurship. So yeah, great point. Emily Heckman, down the street from me in Santa Barbara right now, thank you for this wonderful question. This is huge. How can we be strong allies to whistleblowers and others who risk so much for the greater good?
Yeah, so I think really commending whistleblowers. I actually talked about, I think in chapter 8 of my book, that one of the things we should do is stop calling them whistleblowers. We should call them people of conscience. That part of the issue is that whistleblower has such a tattletale kind of negative thing. And so part of it is respecting and accepting and applauding people who are willing to blow the whistle and to not think of them as doing something negative. And that's really important.
That's beautiful. Language is everything. A friend of mine works for a language consulting company. They came up with global warming for climate change, the death tax with the estate tax, and you realize what an impact these words can have on how we view these concepts. So that's brilliant. Okay, last question for now. If we have time at the end, we'll go back to more. Amy, this was a wonderful question. Thank you for this. Does your book discuss some of the ways we can practice being ready for when we find ourselves in a situation?
Yes, and just very briefly, what my book does is chapter 1 talks about times in which, frankly, people act poorly in a group. I didn't talk about that today. Chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 talk about the first part of what I talked about today. What are the sort of psychological factors that lead people to not step up? Chapter 6 talks specifically about bullying, what happens in schools. Chapter 7 talks specifically about sexual misconduct in colleges. Chapter 8 talks about workplace misconduct of all types, from Enron to police departments. Chapter 9 talks about moral rebels. So who are the people who speak up? And chapter 10, my favorite chapter, does exactly what Amy asked. It gives people practical skills, 10 of them in fact, that they can use in different kinds of situations to be able to step up. Yes.
Catherine, we have all followed the news on what happened with George Floyd. It is horrifying and maddening that no one spoke up. I mean, and of course it's noteworthy that one of the other officers was not Caucasian, and he did not speak up. But all of us maybe in our lives will find situations not quite like that, but times when when it's the right thing to do to speak up for whatever reason. And you have helped give us the inspiration and the tools to do that and to encourage the people in our orbits to speak up. And through that, you are changing the world. So thank you for your work. What is the best way that we can support you other than buying the book? And we will send the link to the book to everybody.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I think it's super important to talk about this because honestly, I love talking about it. And you can buy the book. I'd love for you to buy the book, but you can also, the book is on Audible with me reading it. And so just basically trying to shed light to other people, because I think the more that we talk about the psychology of inaction, the more we can actually inspire people to step up in all kinds of situations.
Love that. Catherine, thank you so much. As Matt just wrote, heroes are not afraid, they just act. I love that.